lesson is trust. It's trusting in God. Because to establish a relationship with God, we got to have trust with Him. That's like with our spouses and with our children and our friends. There's got to be trust gained in there somewhere. So, in order for things to work out, we got to trust God, give Him all our problems or situations, trust in Him to provide, and let it be of His will. Because if we try to do something on our own, what's usually going to happen? It's going to fail. We'll fall flat on our face. But Gideon was trusting in God, trusting in what needed to be done. So we can see when Gideon is starting out at the beginning of this lesson, he had 32,000 troops. Still, that wouldn't have been enough against the Midianite army. Because if you look at the Midianite army, they had 120,000 soldiers. So they were already outnumbered by a substantial amount. But God was giving them tests along the way. The first test was a test of courage. And with this test of courage, Gideon stepped out, said, all right, the Lord was pointed out to him. He said, all right, get with these men, and the ones that are too afraid to go against the Midianite army, tell them they can pack up and go home. Well, I'm sure in the back of Gideon's mind, it might be just a handful of people, maybe 100, 200 people. No, it was 22,000 people that walked off. They were scared. I bet he was really wondering, man, what kind of army do I have here with me? You start out with 32,000, and are you sure, Lord? You want me to ask them? If you can go home, you can go home, no issues. So they did. 22,000. So that left with 10,000. Still, it's a pretty big number. That's still a big difference. 10,000 soldiers against 120,000. That's a large number. And if we look at it, that's a 12-to-1 ratio. That's wild. So we can see again, starting in verse 4, that God was telling Gideon, hey, we need to try the soldiers again. We need to try them again. So I'm sure Gideon's like, all right. He's obeying. Because when we read in the text in the book, verses 5 through 7, we see that that Gideon is obeying what God told him to do. So he's telling him, take your troops down to the water. He's wanting them to pay attention to what they're doing. Because he's saying, okay, if your men go down there and they stick their heads in the water and they're drinking it with their tongues, this is a good illustration I used the other day. When a dog is drinking out of a bowl, can it see what's going on around it? Its eyes are focused on what's in front of it, which is that water bowl. So as Gideon is watching these troops and watching them how they're sitting there drinking that water, God's saying, look at this other group. This other group was more vigilant. So when they would get down to the water, what were they doing? They get on their knees, they get down on the water, they had their hands cupped, they were drinking the water, but as they were drinking the water, they were paying attention to what was around them. They were being vigilant. So that was the second test. That's showing them, all right, God pointed out, you see how all these men are drinking this water? I want you to separate them into two groups. So Gideon obeyed. He said, all right, Lord. What happens with these 10,000 soldiers? You see, 300 were the only ones left when they split them into the two groups, because of the 300 were the ones that was being vigilant. They were watching what was going on around them as they were drinking the water. because he knew that he could depend and trust on them 300 soldiers. God had put them there for a reason. He was going to let his glory shine with them 300. So at the beginning of this lesson, Gideon starts out with 32,000. The test one of the courage knocks it down to 22,000. Or you lose 22,000 soldiers, so that's 10,000. Then just by simply watching them drink the water, he lost 9,700 troops down to 300 men. Now you tell me, wouldn't that make you a little iffy? Make you worry a little bit? You start having some trust issues, wouldn't you? Definitely when it comes to saying, all right, Lord, I got 300 men going against 120,000. No way mathematically does that make sense. But see, that there is a good representation of how God is. When we see something impossible, like with Gideon's army, 300 people against an army of 120,000, that is impossible. But what does it say? With anything, all things are possible with God. So all they had to do was put their trust in God. But I'm sure Gideon, in the back of his mind, he's like, all right, I don't know, but I'm going to go with what the Lord's telling me to do. Because, there's times like that for us. We're like, God's telling us to go do something, but yet we're questioning, like, are you sure? But, if we follow through, we get to see his blessings unfold in front of us. So, one thing I wanted to add out of this was, it says on page 95, it says the main thing and the plain thing talking about this point is that the Lord downsized the army so that he would receive all the glory for defeating Israel's enemies. It says that the weaker Israelites would be forced to do what? To completely trust in the Lord. So they had to completely trust in him. They wouldn't know halfway, half out deal. They had to have complete trust if they wanted to defeat these Midianites. So let's read verse 8. Who would like to read for me? Go ahead, Kenny. 8. See, again, we see Gideon obeyed. So we see that, and we also see that he sent everyone back to their tents except the 300. But pay attention to what the 300 had with them. We see that the 300 left behind took the provisions and trumpets from those who returned home. Keep that in mind. It says that we see that Gideon was, you know, he was fearful. Any man would be in that position that he was in, getting ready to prepare to go into battle. Any of us going against a big obstacle like what they were getting ready to go against with the Midianites and the Amalekites, we see that was going to be a hard battle. But see, God placed one of the Midianite soldiers in his way for a reason, to where he can overhear him. Because we can see that he could overhear one of the men saying, "We're going to be defeated by Gideon." I bet the other soldiers were probably laughing. They're like, "Oh, there's no way we can beat them. We can stomp them. It'd be easy. It's just 300. Why does that matter?" But it took him till that moment. Once he realized, he heard that, that's the moment that he finally said, "All right, I'm going to fully trust into you, Lord." But see, even then, up till then, he was obeying what God was telling him to do. But see, he wasn't fully trusting him yet. But after he heard the enemy soldiers say, "We're going to be defeated by his army," that's when he finally said, "All right, we've got this, because this is the Lord. The Lord is showing him that we're going to defeat." But I like what it says here. It said that the Lord recognized Gideon's fertility. He was patient and kind with him. And it said that he had, what did he do? He used the enemy. And he had promised Gideon what was going to happen. They were going to win. They were finally going to get victory. And then it said, and then when Gideon, I like this, it said, Gideon then worshiped the Lord and returned to his camp. He already knew by the time he got to camp that they've already won the battle, but yet they hadn't even stepped foot on the field. They haven't even made the first effort to go forward yet. But see, when we have storms in our lives, if we have that full commitment, just like Gideon has here, it doesn't matter what obstacle comes in our way. We know we got the victory, whatever the outcome might be, because it's the Lord. He's already promised it to us. All we got to do is just fully trust in Him. So, and then it says worship is always a proper response to God's goodness. All right. Verse 19. So we can see that Gideon, he's finally to the point to where he became the mighty man of valor that God had called him to be. So we can see he's already strategizing what he's going to do. We can see that as he takes these 300 men, he's going to divide them into groups of 100. So he's having them stationed around this camp, perfectly stationed where he needs them to be. But pay attention to what they are equipped with. It says, he equipped each man with a ram's horn in one hand and an empty pitcher with a torch inside. That was in the other hand. So they had a horn in one hand and an empty pitcher with a torch on the inside. It didn't say anything about a weapon or anything. Keep that in mind. So they had dispersed themselves around the camp, going exactly as they had laid out their plan. So they wait till the beginning of the middle watch. So they wait till midnight to get ready to go forward. It says that this was a good time because the guards, they were leaving their posts, they were switching out for their replacements. So they got themselves situated to where they needed to be. And then now we see, it says, it was then they blew the trumpets and break the pitchers that were in their hands. So now they knew that was the perfect time because the guards, everything was going around. They knew the exact moment to when to do that. But let's go ahead and jump to verse 20 before I jump ahead. All right, let's do verse 20.
And the three companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and held the lamps in the left hand, and the trumpets in the right hand to blow the ball. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. First they blew their horns, second they smashed their jars, third they held up their lit torches that had been concealed in the jars. In a normal nighttime military maneuver, only someone at the front of the company would have been carrying a lit torch. Gideon's 300 men appeared to be 300 companies surrounding midnight. Finally they shouted, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Even though sword was probably a metaphorical for battle, it is ironic they said sword, because it does not appear that any of them were carrying a sword. So, you know, we always reference the young man, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. God fed over 5,000 people with that, and there was 12 baskets for the man. Right here, who would have ever thought that those are weapons? Anything we've got that God uses as a weapon against Satan, against our back.
Yep.
And we just got to trust him. If he tells you to go pray in a corner, he tells you that whatever he does, do it.
Right.
Just do it. Because there's a reason.
There is a reason behind it. Oh.
I like saying this, when it just don't make sense.
Yep. And it makes me wonder when these soldiers they had a horn and they had an empty pitcher with a torch inside. How crazy did you think they probably felt going, positioning themselves, getting ready to go? But when it was time, when they were blowing their horns and they finally broke in pitchers, they were probably thinking, man, this is still not making much sense. But if you pay attention in the text, that only one person in a normal nighttime maneuver like this, usually in front of a company, you only had what? You only had one person. So everybody had a torch. So they had 300 soldiers had 300 torches. So when the enemy was looking out and they can see all these torches lit up, they thought there was way more than 300 men. They were thinking, wow, that was 300 companies. They were thinking, oh my, we thought they only had, so many soldiers. No, they got way more than we do. So we can see that things are not getting ready to go the way that the Midianites were thinking. But as they are doing this, we see that they're shouting out that the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. They've got their full trust in the Lord. They're ready to go forward. But I like what it says here in the commentary. It says, even though sword was probably metaphorical for battle, it is ironic they said sword because it didn't appear that anybody was had one. So they didn't have a weapon by their side. But still, though, it's pretty neat to think that they might not have had a sword, but look, they got God on their side. What more do you need? All right, verses 21 through 22. Yeah, I can't say them either. So all after all this madness that is going on, we can see that the Midianite camp was they were scared. They didn't know what to think because, like I said there a few moments ago, you know, when you're used to one person having that torch, representing one company, when they seen all 300 torches, they were like, "Oh wow, this is a big. This army is a lot larger than ours. They're scared." So we can see that they were trying to escape. But before all this happened, that one Midianite soldier had that dream that Gideon's army was going to defeat them. So it wasn't only just that one soldier that had that dream. It had went through most of the camp that we see in the text. So we know that they had the dream that they were going to be defeated at this battle. But I like what it says here because if you remember, Gideon's army didn't have no sword. But what does it say here? It says, even with all this chaos that's going on, the Midianites were attacking each other with what? Their own swords. God's people was being protected the whole time, even amidst all this chaos and craziness going around them, that they were still being protected. Even though they physically might not have had a sword to fight, but the enemy was taking themselves out. God had done set everything up. Now everything was just going into play. Sometimes we just need to sit back and watch God play out the role that we need to let Him play out. Because sometimes we want to rush through and make it the way we want to, but God's saying, no, sit back and let me do it. Just be still, yeah. So we don't know where all these soldiers have went, but we know that they were fleeing back east. They were wanting to go back to their homeland because they were scared of Gideon's army coming in. And the only thing they knew to do was to hightail it back home. All right. Verse 23. So we can see that after the battle was won, that Gideon went back to call upon his men. But as we can see in the text, it says it's not clear if God had given Gideon his blessing to call these new men, but he was calling them back into service. But I like what was added here at the very end. It said that God fulfilled his word. He was going to go in. Maybe at the time it didn't make sense to Gideon, even though he, like I said, he started out with 32,000 men. He probably thought in his mind, this don't make sense. And then when he had the first test, we're down to 10,000. Well, it still don't make sense. But, and then we see that it got down to finally 300. You know, like I said earlier, it might not make sense, but God had left it there for the 300 for a reason. And it was them to glorify God. And they were going to go in, but they had to be fully committed. But we see that God fulfilled his promise right here. That he gave them the victory. And I like what it says here. It's less sense. It says he still stands ready to go into any battle with his people. He's ready to go. He's going to protect us. Just like he did here with Gideon's people. Because we see that in the midst of all that chaos, the enemy was taking themselves out. But something I found interesting, and I know that we're not going to touch on it in the lesson here, was I was reading through Judges, and I came across two verses. It was in Judges 8. And this was after the battle and everything. And the men of Israel's talking to Gideon. It says here, Judges 8, verses 22 and 23, it says, Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us. They're wanting Gideon to rule over them. It said, Both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. So they're wanting Gideon to take over. Rule over us, Gideon. Gideon says, hold on a minute, in verse 23. It says, And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. He brings it all to a point here. It says, The Lord shall rule over you. He's just bringing it to a point. He said, It's not me. It wasn't me that done any of this. This is of the Lord. This is who you need to rule over you. Because he's just merely a man. Gideon is. He's pointing that out. But all they had to do for this lesson, all Gideon had to do, all the 300 soldiers had to do, was completely put their trust in God and let God work through everything. It was a wonderful lesson. I enjoyed that lesson pretty good. But next lesson, Sunday, will be on page 100. It'll be compromise. We'll be talking about Samson. Yes, it will.